In Russian fairy tales, there are two kinds of water, the living water and the dead water. Dead water is used to wash the wounds of the fallen main character so that his wounds would heal, while living water brings him back to life after that. Have you ever come across anything like that? The idea that the water is not always the same and that it can actually have two different characters, that it can be of different nature. For a long time, I used to think that it was something specifically Russian. But several days ago, I found out that this idea goes far beyond Russian folktales and even extends to different elements as well. There is a linguistic theory that in the Proto-Indo-European language, the language which is the father of many languages from Europe and even part of Asia, in that language there were two words. The elements were understood in two different ways, as substances and as active force. And what is particularly interesting to us is that this theory explains why languages of the same group or the same family use different roots for the same elements. Like in the case of water. There's water in English, voda in Russian, and they sound very similar and obviously have the same root, but at the same time we have aqua in Latin, agua in Spanish. This theory explains this difference extremely well, and that's what we're going to talk about today. This is a bilingual podcast in Russian and English. First, I'll tell the story in Russian and then I'll repeat it in English so you can understand it better. My name is Ekaterina, my last name is Zaitseva. I teach Russian. If you're not studying Russian, you can watch the English-only version directly. I'll put the link in the description. В 20 веке французские лингвисты Antoine, Meillet и Émile Benveniste предложили интересную гипотезу о том, что наши далекие предки, ancestors, которые говорили на проиндоевропейском языке, in the Proto-Indo-European language, они использовали два слова, когда говорили о стихиях. Стихия – это element in English. То есть у них было две воды, два огня, две земли, потому что они видели разный характер у стихии. Стихия могла быть активная и пассивная, как инструмент для человека. Like a tool for humans. Давайте посмотрим на слово «вода». Это живая вода, living water. Это вода, которая движется. Это вода в дожде, вода в реке, вода в водопаде, in a waterfall. И для этой воды использовали корень, the root, хе-э-ка-э-хе. И мы видим его сегодня в латинском языке, слово aqua, в испанском языке, в слове agua. А для воды, у которой нет воли, the type of water that doesn't have its will, то есть это вода, которая не движется, как вода в пруде или вода в кружке. Эта вода называлась водор, корень водор, и мы видим его в русском языке, это слово вода, и в английском языке water. Со временем из проиндоевропейского языка вышли другие языки и группы языков, германские языки, славянские, романские. И каждый язык брал один из этих корней. И поэтому сегодня мы видим что в русском языке и в английском языке мы используем пассивный корень воды, а в испанском используют активный корень воды. In the 20th century, two French linguists, Antoine Meillet and Émile Benveniste, proposed a striking idea. They suggested that in the Proto-Indo-European language, there used to be two different ways of seeing natural elements. In other words, there were two waters, two fires, two earths. And the reason was that people saw two different sides to each element. The same element could act on its own, could move on its own. But it also could exist in a more passive form, more like a material or substance or a tool that served humanity. Take the word water, for instance. Water's active force would be the type of water that moves on its own. That will be the water in the rain, in the river, the water in a waterfall, whereas the water that does not move or that it uses people in some form, for example, water in a jug, did not move in water would be the water in the pond. That's a passive representation of this force. It would be called a different way. For the living water, they used the root H-E-K-E-H, and we find it in the Latin word aqua and in the Spanish agua. While the water as a passive material was used with the root vodr, W-O-D-R. And we find it in the English word water and the Russian voda, and also in the Greek hydro. And as the languages evolved and formed different groups, like the Germanic languages, Slavic languages, Romance languages, they all preserved one of those roots. So that's how we got one root in Germanic and Slavic languages, the one of the passive water, and the other one, the active one, was preserved in the Romance languages. У слова огонь, fuego, fire, очень похожая ситуация. С одной стороны, есть огонь как активная, даже сакральная сила, like a sacred force. Это огонь, который действует, который выходит из-под контроля, gets out of control. Мы видим этот тип огня, например, в санскрите, в слове «агни», и в латыни, в слове «игнис». Это корень «хнгни». И он есть в испанском слове «fuego» и в русском слове «огонь». А с другой стороны, есть огонь как физический элемент. Это, например, огонь на плите. Мы готовим на этом огне. То есть это огонь как инструмент. В проиндоевропейском языке использовали корень PEHUR для этого огня. И мы видим его в греческом, в древнегреческом, in the ancient Greek, это слово пир. И еще это английское слово fire. Now, let's move on to fire. What are the two roots to represent it? And, more interestingly, which of them do we find in English and Russian? So, with fire, we find a very similar situation. On the one hand, there is fire as active force. Fire that transforms, consumes, gets out of control sometimes. It can be even viewed as a sacred force. This kind of fire appears in the Sanskrit Agni, or the Latin word ignis. The root here is HNGNI. And this root gave the Spanish word fuego and the Russian word огонь. By the way, the plural in Russian is agni, which sounds so strikingly similar to agni in Sanskrit. And on the other hand, there is fire as a substance, material. We can say domesticated fire, like the fire in the hearth, the fire that we cook on. The root for this word will be P-E-H-U-R. We find it in the ancient Greek word pyr, and also in the modern English fire. So up to this point, this theory makes sense even to us modern people, because we can understand seeing water and fire as active elements. But what about other types of elements, like earth? How can it be perceived in two different modes? Let's hear that next part. It's particularly interesting also because it's going to reveal the way some nations perceive the human nature. Земля – это самая нейтральная стихия. Это просто место. Но оказывается, it turns out, у нее тоже может быть два характера. Это земля как место, как территория, и это земля как мать. Земля, которая рождает. The one that gives life. Земля как мать – это корень дегом. Этот корень есть в русском слове земля, earth, и он трансформировался, и в русском его форма зем. Но мы не видим этот корень в испанском слове tierra или в английском слове earth. Зато мы находим этот корень и в английском, и в испанском, но в другом слове. В латинском языке было слово humus. Humus – это земля. It's like soil. И слово humus дало слово humano или human, то есть человек. И это уже космогоническая идея. Человек создан из земли. It's made of earth. Как фраза из Библии. Прах ты, и в прах возвратишься. А если мы говорим о земле как о материале, о субстанции, в проиндоевропейском языке был корень терх или эрс. И мы видим его в слове tierra и в слове earth. Earth seems to be the most neutral of all the elements, just a surface. But here too, turns out there are two ways to perceive it. So yes, you can view it as just a soil, a territory, but also like an entity that gives life, basically like mother. And the idea of Mother Earth is associated with the root degom. We find this root in the Russian language, in the word land, which is земля. The root here is zem, and well, it is that ancient root degom, but obviously it got transformed and changed its shape over the time and traveling across many languages. However, you do not find this root in the Spanish word tierra or the English word earth. But this root is preserved, both in Spanish and in English, in a different word. The word that came from Latin. In Latin there was a word humus that meant earth or soil, just like in the Proto-Indo-European language. And that word humus gave the origin to the modern word human or in Spanish, humano. And that word reflects the myth of our creation. The human being understood as something made of earth. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. And the other root, which was used to speak of the earth as material, as soil or territory, was the root terh or ers. We find it in the modern Spanish word tierra and in the English word earth. So, in the end, a rather curious picture begins to emerge. Modern English seems to have inherited exclusively the roots that view nature elements as materials or tools. Russian, on the other hand, prefers the roots that view the elements as something active. And Spanish falls somewhere in between, seeing more dynamic elements like water and fire as active forces, while treating more passive elements like land or air like substances. Of course, this does not mean that we can draw some conclusion on the mentality of English speakers or Russian speakers. What it does suggest, I think, is a more subtle idea, that the words do not just carry meanings, they also preserve the ways our ancestors used to see and feel and understand the world. What do you think of this theory? And if you are interested in words, culture, and the way the languages shape our perception of the world, feel free to subscribe. I have so much more to talk about. See you next time. Пока-пока.